2, 3. Just give me patience, yeah.
What up, Z-Pack? It's your boy Z-Dog MD. Today we are doing Against Medical Advice, which means it's Suit Sunday. All right? Tom Heineberg's got his suit.
What's up, Pack?
Logan has, I'll just put suit in quotes. America. All right, we are talking about something near and dear to everyone's heart in healthcare, and that is empathy. Empathy. How many times have we heard that word in our training? If you're a nurse, they're like, empathy. It's about empathy. It's about empathy. If you're the Cleveland Clinic, you make an entire video to encourage your staff and doctors to be empathic. But what does it mean, and why is it evil? We're going to talk about that today. First, we have to define what it is. And I want to say this. It's funny. For me, empathy was a driving point of everything that I'd done in healthcare. When I did a graduation speech in 1999 from UCSF and I put it on YouTube, that was my first foray into YouTube and into public speaking. And in that, I end that speech by saying a little bit of humor and a little bit of empathy go a long way. Wow, was I a dumbass. I'm just saying that was a big mistake. And I'm going to talk about why. The humor part, yes. The empathy part, I might have been right in that a little bit of empathy. Now, I kind of posted an article, and you can see it in the description for this video, that is written by an MIT psychology professor named Paul Bloom. Now, Paul Bloom has studied empathy as well as other things like pleasure and different things like that. And he has come to this conclusion that empathy is not good. And he wrote a book called Against Empathy, and a couple of articles which summarize the book, which I want you guys to read after this if you haven't read them already. I posted them earlier, and the first thing I noticed is a lot of people wrote outraged comments saying, this is BS, it's wrong, we need X, Y, and Z, otherwise we can't be good nurses, doctors, pharmacists, whatever it is. Human beings. But here's the thing, I think they were not even getting the definition of empathy right. Empathy is feeling somebody else's pain. That's a definition we're going to use in this show. And that is emotional empathy. In other words, feeling what someone else is feeling. Now, there's something called cognitive empathy, which means understanding someone's situation, understanding what they're thinking, understanding what they went through, putting yourself in their head that way. But that's a little different. We're talking about emotional empathy. Are they feeling pain? Are they hurting? Are they suffering? Are they joyful? Those kind of things. And we need to distinguish it from compassion, which is love in the face of suffering, concern for others and love for others without any qualifications. Very different. And then sympathy. What do you think sympathy is, Tom?
Sympathy would be like, I pity you. I mean, that would be how I take the word. I mean, what's your definition?
No, I think that's exactly right. In the way that it's used, it's pity. It's like, I feel bad for this guy. Like, this poor suffering person, ooh, I feel really bad. And it has a very different connotation than empathy, which is I feel your suffering. I feel your suffering. Or compassion, which is I see that you're suffering. I am concerned for you and I love you, but I'm not going to feel your pain and I'm not going to feel bad for you. I'm going to feel love in the face of your suffering. All right, on that definitional basis, we can proceed with talking about this. And why is it important? Because we are burning out in mass, Z-Pack, in healthcare. They are calling this compassion fatigue. It's not compassion fatigue. I'm going to argue in this piece today on Against Medical Advice with your input that this is actually empathy fatigue that we have, and that empathy, if you listen to Paul Bloom and you believe what he's saying, and I actually do, I'm convinced, empathy can be harmful in the setting of healthcare. And what can we do to make ourselves better clinicians, better caregivers, better administrators, better insurance people? It's compassion, not empathy. And let me unpack all of this in the course of this. All right. Tom, anything to add before we go on?
I think empathy is, my definition of empathy would be literally, I am you. It's almost like, that's why it's such a high ideal in our society, because it's like the golden rule. I am you, I feel as though you feel, I would treat you as though I would want to be treated. That's how everybody thinks of it.
And I think Tom speaks for, the truth of the matter in this case, which is that empathy is, I believe, an evolved characteristic. And Paul Bloom says you can actually measure it. There are tests to measure it. So 0 to 6, how empathic are you naturally? You can also train it, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the idea that it allows you to put yourself in someone else's shoes, and there's a reciprocity there, so that the golden rule, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you, only works if you know what others are feeling. And that is the fascinating bit. Now, psychopaths, people with antisocial personality disorder, some people with autism, they lack the classic definition of empathy, but we're going to tease that out a little bit more and what it means for their state of morality, their behavior, and their place in society later. And spoiler alert, empathy does not determine their success or failure or relative evil. It's many other things.
Well, can we talk about one of the myths that Paul Bloom had in his article, which was that psychopaths have no empathy? That's actually a myth.
So actually, let's unpack it a bit. That psychopaths have no empathy is a myth in two ways. One is it's not just that they have no empathy. They have very low emotional feeling, period, across the board. Everything is tamped down, including empathy. But the fact that psychopaths can be predicted by low empathy scores, or that criminal behavior can be predicted by low empathy scores, has been disproven by the data. At least the data suggests that it's not the case.
Bloom used a great word, which was deadened.
Deadened.
All of their emotions are deadened, which I thought was interesting as it relates to burnout, because when people get into drugs and alcohol, what are they trying to do to their emotions? See?
Yeah.
Trying to deaden their emotions.
And one of the cardinal signs of burnout in healthcare is deadening of empathy, deadening of emotion. So in a way, we acquire psychopathy as a coping mechanism to allow us to survive in the face of insurmountable pain. Let's talk about that, because that's the heart of what I want to get at. That's exactly it. So what I want to talk about too is what Paul said in his articles, Paul Bloom. Empathy is like a spotlight. And this is what that means. It means that it can only shine on a very narrow area at once. You can only feel one or two people's pain or emotions at once. You cannot feel a population. You cannot feel a statistical abstraction. You cannot feel a broad group of people. And more narrowly, empathy tends to shine on people that we can relate to, that we can feel their pain. So our neighbor, our friend, our family, we can empathize and understand what they're going through much more acutely than we can with a starving child in Africa that doesn't look like us, that doesn't speak our language, that doesn't sound like us, that's in a strange place. And that's one of the aspects of empathy that give it a spotlight-like characteristic. And it's the crux of why empathy fails on so many levels to inform rational, moral decision-making in complex systems.
You know, you said one or two. I have to wonder if families with lots of children, like the Duggars, have 20 children, can you have the same empathy for every child?
I would say no. I'd say not at once. So you can't think about the good of the entire clan at once. You might think of like little Billy and little Jane, but then beyond that it gets foggy. Your peripheral vision is bad with empathy. And you know, part of the bit about this is that empathy in that setting, if you look at Mother Teresa, he quotes her in the piece, she says, "If I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at the one, I will." And that's the magic of empathy, because it motivates actual altruism and behavior, because we can feel that one person's pain.
That's almost like Mother Teresa biohacking herself. She's saying, I only have sympathy, empathy for one person, so I'm going to use it to apply to as many people as I can.
And that's how she was using it.
Right.
Of course, I think she's a total hack. Mother Teresa, what a joke. I'm kidding. I'm just trying to generate hate, and it's working. Look at those little love signs. Anyway, so the idea that empathy could actually bias us towards populations that are our own, could actually lead then to moral mistakes. So where if you're looking at improving the suffering or improving the well-being of conscious entities, which is one way to define kind of morality, a moral act is something that improves those things, empathy can fail us, because what will happen is it will distort our moral judgments, and in a way that like prejudice does. Because by feeling, and a good example that he gives is the Newtown massacre, Sandy Hook, those kind of things. When these poor kids were killed in that setting, there was an outpouring of support. People were sending toys. Poor people were sending toys to this rich, affluent community. And it was a distortion of the fabric of what's actually just, because in the same year, more children died in Chicago violence than did in Sandy Hook. But that was not felt by people, because it was a number of people, it was statistically abstract, and the Sandy Hook, everyone can relate to the little kid in kindergarten who this monster comes in and shoots them, right? But in Chicago, how do you relate? There's random acts of gang violence, there's neglect, it's a complex situation.
And I would argue that socio-politically, this is a feature of the far right, where they say, I have empathy, but only for my group.
Yeah.
And you should have empathy for your group, and you should fix your group. And that's what they say about the inner city. I don't like that. I don't like that far right ideology. Just as I don't like it when it's rampant on the far left, where they say we should have empathy for everybody. Everybody's a beautiful snowflake. That doesn't work either. So what's the answer?
Well, so this is interesting, and I think it is interesting because looking at the political spectrum of empathy, you're right. Empathy is a tribal manifestation. We first, and it appears just like anger appears early in childhood. It's one of the first sort of things to start to show up. And the idea that you first have empathy for your family, and then your friends, and then your tribe, and then your state, and then your nation. That's the sort of progress of concentric empathy. And it's hard once you get bigger groups. It's not empathy then. Now it's more just a shared concern. And is that empathy? I would argue it may not be. Now on the very far right, I think there is, they're able to empathize more with tribe and sort of close group. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that, that's just an aspect of it. I think on the left, there's a lot of talk about empathy on the very far left. And let's empathize for someone who's transgender, who's gay, who's African American, who's poor, right? And it's a different bias towards empathy. It's a bias towards those who have experienced perceived injustice. So it's very interesting. And justice is a big part of it too, this sense of
totally
right and wrong.
I was having a thought about the far right, and I was thinking that, Christianity is the ultimate empathy story. Jesus comes here to die for our sins. Jesus is God. It's a story that ultimately allows us, we watch him suffer and die, and we empathize with God, and God empathizes with us. And I think that's why it's had such an impact across the globe.
That's an interesting tweak on that, because did we feel compassion for Jesus on the cross? Compassion is love in the face of suffering. Or did we feel empathy? Oh my gosh, it must hurt so much to be on a cross and nailed. And he's going through it, and I feel his pain, and it's horrible suffering, and we should live up to the sacrifice because of all the pain that was involved. So you can argue both. I think I will make the argument in this show that love in the face of Jesus' suffering is, and we are a Sunday, so
it's a Sunday.
It's good we're talking about
Sunday
this.
Special.
Love in the face of Jesus' suffering is a more advanced and productive and moral response than feeling Jesus' direct pain, and we're going to get into why. And you're right. I think that's why it resonates across cultures, and it has done so well as a religion.
This is why to this day we wear crucifixes on our neck to remind us of the sacrifice Jesus made. I don't, because I'm not Christian.
That's right.
But other people do.
Well, and the Buddhist pantheon of belief is a little bit different. In the Buddhist belief, they actually distinguish between empathy and compassion. And they argue that a Buddha, someone who's striving to be enlightened, should avoid empathy because it will tire you, it will burn you out. Whereas compassion, a broad love for anybody and concern for suffering, is more productive to improving the lot of everybody and leading to enlightenment. So on that note, let's unpack it a little bit more. Black Lives Matter. Okay, look at I remember we talked about Black Lives Matter on a live a while back.
Right, yeah, after the Philando
Castillo. And man, the polarization in the comments. Now, I would argue that polarization, each side was justified if they're acting from empathy. So the side that they may have been minority, or they may have friends who are minorities, they may identify with that community, especially African Americans, were like, how can you argue that this is not an injustice? And then the other side might empathize with the police officer who's facing danger every day and who looks and feels and sounds like them. So again, it's a tribal empathy, feeling the pain of the side you identify with. That's the narrow focus of empathy.
Yeah, totally. And this is a huge problem in the healthcare tribe.
Yeah.
For all the obvious reasons, burnout, etc., drug abuse, etc., suicide, etc.
All of that, and we're going to get to that in a second, because I think that's going to be the crux of my call to action for you guys and what we can do as 3.0 minded healthcare tribes people, for lack of a better word, to actually improve burnout. Some action items that we can do today that'll help us. And so actually looking back at this, let's think about vaccines and how empathy distorts that. Look at the anti-vaccine community. They will point to a single child, say, who suffered a vaccine reaction, which happens, right? You can have adverse reactions to vaccines. And they will go and they'll name the name. Little, Rebecca Smith is an example that was given. Little Rebecca Smith died after a vaccine reaction, got Guillain-Barré or had an anaphylactic reaction, whatever it is, and died. And they feel this little girl's pain, empathize with her family. They look like her, they feel like her. They can feel that because one person's pain you can feel. But then, what if you said, okay, by banning vaccines now, hundreds, if not thousands of children are going to die randomly of disease. How do you empathize with that? That's a statistical abstraction. Empathy fails. And that's why I think it gets back to Mother Teresa. By feeling one's pain, you can actually do something. You can act. It's very hard to feel the pain of the many. And that's where you get distortions in moral judgment. And anti-vaxxers are a great example of that.
Oh, totally. Because empathy led them to that conclusion, and then empathy won't allow them to jettison from that conclusion.
To jettison from it. And here's an interesting thing. I myself, one of my characteristics is, and Tom may or may not agree, is that I score high on empathy scale. So I have a lot of empathy, and in other words, I feel people's pain whether I want to or not. I have trouble watching movies that have a lot of violence in them because I feel that. I watched Breaking Bad, the entire thing, because it was such a compelling story, but when it was done, it was so dark, and I empathized with every single character, even the villains, one by one, that when it was done, I was just in a depressed state for like 2 months. Like I couldn't pull out of it because it was so dark, and I took it all in and felt it, right? And I think with anti-vaxxers, a great example. I can't empathize with the massive anti-vaxxers because I think they're crazy, dangerous psychopaths. But a single mother will email me and say, my child suffered a vaccine injury, and you're advocating all this stuff, and don't you feel my pain? And then I do feel her pain, and then I vacillate. You know the Oz thing, the clip we did?
The fake, the April Fool.
By the way, so I told Tom, I was like, we should do an April Fool's thing, maybe something about Dr. Oz, and he comes up with this idea. He wakes up in the morning and he's like, okay, we're just gonna pretend that he calls you and we're gonna do this rewind thing. And I'm like, wow, that's really good if we can pull it off. And I think we actually did pull it off. We fooled a lot of you guys. But at the end of the clip it says, and now remember, I had a call with Oz's medical director, okay, Michael Kripane, I think, and the head of his charity, and they were good, lovely human beings who we connected deeply. Now, I empathize with them. They never told me don't make fun of Oz. They never told me. They just said, this is what we're trying to do. We're hoping we can collaborate, right? Now, because I met them now, I have this empathy. I felt really bad about doing that video. And Tom was like at the end, he's like, okay, how about this? Still hate you, Oz. And we both burst out laughing. And I thought it was the funniest thing ever. And then I was like, we got to change it though. And he's like, why? Like, you've made a whole brand out of hating on Oz. And I was like, because I know them now. Like, I can't say hate and put it, I mean, this is a human being. You see what I mean? So empathy almost ruined a pretty good joke. And that in itself is an indictment.
I know.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? So all that being said, I think let's move on to healthcare. And this is going to be the crux of it. And then we're going to take a bunch of comments because I know that you guys are like, ready to punch someone, and that's what I like. That's what I like. Logan's like, yes, yes,
They're
yes.
Mad. They're
But
very mad.
very mad. But you know what, Logan? Hit me. Sons! Let's talk about why empathy is bad in healthcare and what's better. All right? Now the thing about healthcare is that it is possible in healthcare to feel other people's pain on a one-on-one basis. We do it all the time, right? In nursing school, they teach you empathy, 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 empathy. In medical school, they try to train it into you. There are fake actor patients, these simulated patients, who their whole goal is to try to test whether you are being empathic, whether you have expressed that you feel that patient's pain. And the question is this leading to smart decisions medically? Is it leading to sustainable careers for us, the tribe of healthcare? And I would argue no and no. And let me tell you why. Empathy in itself, on an individual basis, often leads to suffering avoidance. So you feel a kid's pain and you maybe hold off on that shot, or you feel a drug addict's pain and maybe you give them the Dilaudid, right? So to avoid suffering, you act in the short term out of empathy, out of feeling their pain. Whereas what they really need is a long-term solution that in the short term inflicts suffering. Those of us who are parents know this. You sometimes have to make your kids do things that they hate. That's for their good in the long run. Eat your vegetables. Don't punch that kid in the face. All the other things that we do. And so it's this kind of idea of creating long-term suffering alleviation by causing some suffering in the short term. And empathy derails that because you feel their pain. It's very difficult to act in a way that causes more suffering. The other issue with that is, I mean, and this is the reason why I couldn't go into pediatrics. I had so much empathy. I would walk into the emergency department, I'd hear a kid crying, and I would just, crumble into a ball. And there are a lot of people who say, it's like, I can't work in oncology, I can't work in pediatric oncology, I can't work in pediatrics, because the feeling of the pain, not just of the parents, of the children, but of the parents who are suffering unspeakable loss, right, is crippling. So empathy can be a problem. There are people with very high empathy, and this is an argument, Tom. Tell me if you agree with this. Women suffer more depression and anxiety than men. This is a statistical fact. Women also score higher on empathy scales than men. And there is some data that Paul Bloom supports to say that there is a correlation between high empathy and depression, because feeling people's pain constantly leads to pain. It's an aversive experience. It's like me watching Breaking Bad and going away being depressed for 2 months, right?
Yeah, totally. Well, I think this is why women are more evolved than men, is because women have higher empathy, but then it can do them a disservice when it runs amok.
Yeah.
You know, when they're having empathy for everyone and everything at all times.
Well, and when their happiness is dependent on the happiness of others. So sometimes that's a kind of a phenotype where everyone has to be supported and happy, or the person is really
You see this in early motherhood, man. These like kids just like drag on. They like drain mom in a way that you don't see them drain dad.
Yeah, no, dad
is like, what? I don't know.
This happens to me constantly, man.
Yeah.
Like my kids, stuff will happen, and I'm like, you got to walk it off, because I have my empathy shield up, because I said I had a lot of empathy, but compared to my wife, or actually probably any random woman, I'm still just walled off, right? Just compared to maybe, I'm probably in the 80th percentile for men in empathy, all right?
That's why they called her Mother Teresa, and she's known for being the most empathetic of all, right?
It's a thing. Although, there's some argument that she was more compassionate than empathic, but her own quote belies that empathy was a big part of what she's doing. So in the setting of that, the question is, can you, in healthcare, how can we harness the power of love, compassion, empathy to actually do good without burning ourselves out? And if you look at what actually works in healthcare. So we talk about compassion fatigue. So nurses burn out, doctors burn out, they put up a wall, they stop feeling. Why is that? Is that because they have love in the face of suffering, or is it because they are feeling so much pain that they have to put up a wall? They have to become a psychopath and deaden it. Right? I mean, what are your thoughts? Your wife is a NICU nurse. Does she feel empathy for every poor little child who dies?
I would tell you that every time there's a really severe case of something happening to a child, it's like 2 or 3 days before she even goes back to baseline. Because she still feels it.
What's the delta that you see? In other words, what is she experiencing that's different than her normal self when you see this? Because you're an objective.
She's mildly depressed for days afterwards.
Yeah.
And then we'll be having like a household fight about like something stupid, like you didn't do the dishes. It's always like, I didn't do the dishes.
Of course it is.
Because I never do the dishes.
Because does he look like a kind of guy who does the dishes?
And no, it's some menial, like little average marriage fight, right? And then she'll like look at me and just be like, you don't understand that I saw a fucking baby die today.
Yeah.
Like, I don't give a shit about your problems right now.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's like me offloading on her.
Yeah.
And then she's like, I don't care about this.
Yeah.
Like, I have used it all up, and it wasn't on you, buddy.
Yeah.
All right? I'm like, fair enough. I'm like, fair enough. I get it.
How many of you, Z-Pack, have had this experience? I mean, we take everything onto our shoulders, and then we come home, and then there's more to give, right? So this is the fatigue, I would say. It's empathy fatigue. It's feeling other people's pain. When I don't know if I told you the story. When I was, one of my early rotations as a second-year resident was oncology. And oncology was people like me, at Stanford, people like me, young, otherwise healthy people getting life-threatening cancer and suffering. And seeing their family go through it and seeing them go through it. And within the first day, I had a breakdown. I just was basically in the stairwell crying, right? Which is not my typical pattern of behavior. Like, I'll cry maybe Q6 months over something dumb, right? But this was like serious, like it had thrown me into depression. And I realized very quickly the only way to survive this rotation was to build a wall, very quick, this big brick wall that, I'll be honest, it never came down until years later, because it's what protected me. And you use humor as a mechanism to help build the wall. You make fun of stuff, you make fun of the consultant, sometimes you make fun of the patient. Sometimes you do these things. That's our gallows humor that we have, right, Z-Pack? And you build this wall, and the problem with that is then you're emotionally deadened, and then you have trouble with love in the face of suffering.
Yeah.
So the question is, how can we survive burnout, which I think is partially driven by empathy fatigue?
And I have to say that if you think it's bad for you as a doc, I know it's worse for my wife, because that is part of nursing, is she's expected to be empathetic. Expected. It's part of her job. Almost. I mean, that's how people view it.
Well, when I posted this article earlier as a prequel to the talk today, I got a lot of nurses writing in, and they were pretty miffed, saying, no, empathy helps me with my patients. No, this is what we're taught to do. No, it's very important. And
they need to do that, because when a doctor dumps on a patient or is real hardline with a patient, they're the one who swoops in and is helps that patient feel good about them. They're providing a service for mental health for that patient, right? Whereas the doctor's just treating their body.
Well, okay, let me. I like this because I want to unpack that, because there's actually an example that Paul Bloom gave, and I think it relates right to healthcare directly, and that is the sort of, does empathy actually help for nurses and doctors to provide better care? And here's what he would argue. He would actually argue not necessarily, including nurses. And this is why. He gave an example. He said, I'm going to read this verbatim actually. He says, an older relative of mine who has cancer going back and forth to hospitals and rehab centers, I watched him interact with doctors and learned what he thinks of them. He values doctors who take the time to listen to him and develop an understanding of his situation. And he benefits from this cognitive empathy. So that's the kind of empathy where you're heard, you listen to someone, you know what they're thinking, you know what they've been through. It's not feeling their pain. It's not taking their pain as your own. And he benefits from this, but emotional empathy is more complicated. He gets the most from doctors who don't feel as he does, who are calm when he is anxious, confident when he is uncertain, and he particularly appreciates certain virtues that have little directly to do with empathy, virtues such as competence, honesty, professionalism, and respect. Now, what you said, Tom, where you said they lift you up, they make you feel good when the doctor was a dick. What I might argue is the doctor was a dick because he's lacking both cognitive and compassion, right? So in other words, he doesn't know this patient situation, and he's closed off, walled off, maybe because of empathy fatigue. And what the nurse is doing is actually using true compassion. They are seeing the suffering and responding with love and lifting that patient up, right, rather than responding with a mirror image of their suffering. And the other quote I want to read about that, which I think is interesting, is from a professional patient. So one of these actresses who their job is to measure empathy and evoke an empathic response in medical students when they're trained. And she said, it's interesting, I had this checklist and I had to measure empathy, but when I got sick and went to the doctor, she said she met one doctor who was cold and unsympathetic to her concerns, and she hated that. That's just psychopathy. That's just emotional numbness, right? That's not compassion or empathy. But then she met with, she was grateful to another who kept a reassuring distance and objectivity. She quote, I didn't need him to be my mother, even for a day. I only needed him to know what he was doing, she writes. His calmness didn't make me feel abandoned, it made me feel secure. I needed to look at him and see the opposite of my fear, not its echo. And that, I think, is a distinction, right? Calm, intelligence, kindness, and love in the face of human suffering. That's what our role is. And that's what I would argue, and people may disagree. I mean, what do you think?
I think it's very hard for some people to turn it off, to distance themselves when they see real suffering going on.
So, my mother is one of those people. I think if I inherited anything wise from her, it was empathy, because she, as a psychiatrist too, she can deeply feel people's pain to the point where it upsets her, right? Where it will bother her for weeks. And if I make fun of Dr. Oz, she will talk to me on the phone. We speak once or twice a week, and she'll say, I know that you're very upset with this fellow, but he's trying, and he's probably a decent fellow. Poor chap, he's suffering if you're making fun of him. And I'm like, he's rich! How can he be suffering? He doesn't even know I exist, right? No. You're paining him with all this. And so that kind of thing where it hurts her to see him hurt. She can't turn it off.
That money piece is kind of interesting. Do you think a lot of docs think that the money will help? It's like, I'm going to get a bunch of money and then I'm just not going to care. I'm going to be above it or something.
it's a common thing that happens because we delay gratification for so long. And I think part of the issue, you know, I had a mentor when I was in residency, when I was in Hawaii doing a rotation. And he kind of reminded me of Magnum PI. He had the little mustache, and he was like, hey, he had the aloha shirt because that's how you roll in Hawaii. He was a hospitalist. And I said, what can you tell me, my master, about the future? Like, what should I expect as an attending? You know, I kind of want to do hospital medicine. And he said, there's a couple things. Number one day you will wake up and you will look at your career and you'll be in the matrix and you'll say, I studied all of that for this, and you'll be emotionally dead. The second thing he said is, you will have all the money that you really need and you'll realize it means nothing. And I was like, shh, that sounds really depressing, and no way is that going to happen to me. And at the bottom of my burnout and my empathy fatigue, that is exactly what I noticed. I was like, I have money, I have a house, I have everything I'm doing everything. I studied for all that for this, to be a cog in a machine where I can't even feel anything, right? And I think that's what a lot of docs, a lot of nurses, a lot of nurse practitioners, all of us struggle with.
You know what I'm interested in is, you've said it so many times that it's just become a story, is when I burned out, when I had empathy fatigue. But what did it feel like to be there?
Didn't feel at all. You know, you just know something's wrong. What it is it's a feeling that you don't care about your patients or your colleagues. They are problems to be solved. You're trying to get through your day. And in this quote, actually, where the woman said, this doctor didn't show me any sort of understanding, that would have been me at one point in my burnout, right? And here I was born with all this empathy, and it had burned me out very rapidly because our system isn't even designed to support that degree of one-on-one sort of concern for patients. It really isn't, especially 2.0, which will burn you out instantly.
And how long were you there before you even noticed you were there? Because I bet you a lot of the audience is there now.
Oh, I will guarantee you that you're there and you don't know it until one day something happens. And usually it's some adverse event or a tragedy. Either you accidentally hurt someone, which luckily didn't happen to me, or your daughter comes to you with a stethoscope on her shoulders and says, I want to be a doctor like you, and you want to, you know, slap sense into her. Like, that's literally what happened to me. And I realized, oh my gosh, this was supposed to be my calling, and instead, I don't want her going anywhere near this field. And you know, it's funny, in my TED Med talk in 2013, I actually talked about empathy as well, in the positive, because I didn't have the understanding I have now. And I did a whole character called the empathy robot that was a way to outsource empathy because I can't do it anymore at the bottom of my burnout. What I should have built was a compassion robot, because that would have helped a lot more, and we'll talk about that next. So should we take some comments and then we'll go to the next piece? All right, what do we got here? Let's see.
Let's go into, Logan wants to play his intro. You guys, we almost robbed Logan of his one
How
moment.
dare you.
Okay.
Look,
that was not very empathetic of us.
Logan has one job. It's to play the intro. All right, let's have some fun, and then we're going to end at the end of all this talking about what is the answer and what can we do to make it better.
I got one right off the bat, Z.
Bring it.
Priscilla Lehman says, I'm looking for my first RN job, and this scares me.
It's not going to scare you. Do you know why? I mean, it should scare you in the sense that do not believe the hype about empathy. I'm going to talk about compassion and how it is an endless, limitless well of love and inspiration that you can bring to your patients, and that is what nursing is at the heart of it. It's about love in the face of suffering, concern for others, and the desire to make suffering better. That's what nurses do. That's what doctors should do. That's what all of us in healthcare should do. And the best administrators that I've talked to on my travels, this is what they care about. They will be moved to tears by the same stories that I tell that move clinicians to tears, because they care about other human beings. They're just in a different aspect of this system or non-system that we have.
And do you think that part of this empathy thing is just like, we're just miscategorizing it? Like, you gave the definition at the beginning of the show. Mm-hmm. We have just misdefined what it is, and everybody who's getting upset about it, they're using the wrong definition, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. So we definitely define it wrong, and empathy and compassion and sympathy all get conflated into one thing. But even beyond that, if we can't define it correctly, that means that we can't understand the damage and the danger that empathy can cause. Now, by the way, when is empathy okay? When is it good? Well, it allows us to be altruistic. By feeling someone else's pain, the golden rule is in effect. So we need it. As a species, we evolved it. We're hyper social. It turns out that primates have empathy as well. When they see one of their tribe attacked, they will come and pat them and console them, right? There is an ability, a theory of mind where it's felt that primates can do this. So this is an evolutionary adaptation. The problem is it's gone haywire in our complex world where we have to think systemically now. We have to think broadly in a global compassion.
Melissa Boudreau says, I left psych and went to cardiac because it's so hard to watch teens struggle. I was there. Went back because I've learned to shut the empathy off and realize what I do is to help them.
So Melissa, it's Melissa, right?
Yeah, Melissa.
What I would argue that you've discovered is that feeling someone else's pain will destroy you over time consistently in these spaces where people are suffering like no other. Look, guys, look, we're in a tribe, all right, of healthcare where we encounter on the daily a war zone worth of suffering every single freaking day. It's what we do. That's what differentiates us from lawyers and engineers and mechanics and everybody else. We see it every single day. Now, how do we approach that? It's love in the face of suffering. We see them, we have concern for their suffering, and we do what we can to make it better. But to take their pain as our own will destroy us and make us make stupid decisions. That's another crucial important part.
That's totally.
Let's see here. When I see suffering, I dive into how do we fix this? Crystal Mosley. So Crystal, the argument that Paul Bloom makes is that the response to suffering should be kindness, love, and intelligence. In other words, let's look at what makes things better as a whole. If you're looking at the opioid epidemic, what can we do systemically to improve the opioid crisis? If you're looking at needle sharing programs, okay, somebody who's empathic might say, oh, that's, it's just going to prolong the damage. Somebody who's looking rationally might say, well, it's actually reducing harm as a whole and reducing suffering. So you have to use intelligence and kindness and compassion. And the thing about, did you have another comment there?
I got a good one.
Yeah.
Danny Clark says, when I told my daughter I left the ER for a desk job, she said, so you don't want to help others anymore? That was hard to hear. And think about how different that is from if her daughter had said, at least you were able to help others for so many years.
Yeah, right.
Like,
or
the tone of it.
Or the desk job is another way to help people.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? That's the other thing. We need to find purpose in our lives, and many of us went into healthcare because we wanted this purpose to help other human beings. Okay, you know what I'm going to do real quick, because I want to talk about this and then we'll go to more comments. What is this compassion that I'm talking about? All right. So the Buddhists have been doing this for millennia, right? They have meditations on how to have love and concern for others. And this gets back to our political thing. We want to be transpartisan when we talk about compassion. So it's a typical evolution of human compassion, which is concern and love for others and a desire to see suffering lessened. It starts with with ourself, our family, our tribe, our nation. Then it goes to the world. And then it goes to all sentient creatures. Those are the concentric circles of love. We're not all at all sentient creatures. The Dalai Lama, Matthew Ricard, who's been studied, by the way, he's a Buddhist monk, also was a biological scientist prior to becoming a monk. So here's a great guy who could actually study stuff. They've done fMRI and stuff on him. When he meditates on empathy, feeling someone else's pain, certain areas in the brain light up that correspond with other people who experience empathy. So we know it's confirmed that's what he's doing. He reports feeling exhausted, depressed, fatigued. When he does the Buddhist metta meditation, which is a meditation where you first focus on maybe yourself, then your loved ones, the concentric circles, and you wish that person or those people happiness, peace, a lack of suffering, and you feel a profound warm love for them. And it's a detached love. It's not the kind of love that involves getting in their head and feeling their pain. It is love in the face of their suffering. You just love them. You can practice it. He reports, and the fMRI lights up a different area, and he reports a huge feeling of well-being and a warm regard and a happy outlook. And they've done studies on follow-up, and what they found was when you train people to do empathy, you can actually focus them on how to feel other people's pain versus training them in compassion using the same kind of Buddhist technology, for lack of a better word. It turns out, and this was the quote from the study, negative affect, meaning emotion, was increased in response to both people and distressed people in all across the board in people who studied empathy. In other words, they felt bad all around, even when people are suffering, even when people feel bad. It is a negative aversive thing to practice empathy. That was the conclusion of this small trial. Whereas those who did the compassion one, okay, they found they were higher in feelings of warmth and care, had a better outlook, and it was associated with better psychological outcomes like boost in short-term mood, long-term happiness. And the conclusion that was made is that if you want to get happy, helping others through compassion is one pretty surefire way to do it.
Polly has a great one. She says, it's a bit simplistic, but can we just go with love and fear as the major categories? When I work from love, things seem to go well, and when I work from fear, not so good.
So many people have tried to reduce all of human experience to love and fear, including Oprah. And in fact, if you listen to Oprah's podcast about how she made her show, she said, really, we saw this dichotomy between love and fear, and we tried to focus on love. And I think it's valid to the extent that in many ways, empathy doesn't come from a love place, it comes from a fear place. They're suffering. Oh, I feel their pain. I'm scared of that, and I'm going to try to make it better, right? For this one individual, because remember, empathy is a narrow spotlight, like we talked about in the beginning of the show. It may be narrow on your friends or family, or one person, or your race, or et cetera, right? So it's a narrow spotlight. Whereas compassion is truly unbounded, just concern and love for everybody when you get at the apex. So the Dalai Lama has love for that little spider that's on the wall, right? And it may not be equal to the love that he has for a sentient child, but it's there nonetheless.
I actually tend to operate really well from fear.
Yeah.
Fear is a powerful motivator for me.
It motivates the elephant.
Yeah. There's this great you ever seen this video of Mike Tyson when he's getting into the ring?
No.
And he goes, when I get close to the ring, I'm scared. I'm nervous. I pictured this man beating me. I dreamed he could beat me. And then he goes, the closer I get to the ring, the more powerful I feel. When I enter the ring, I'm a god. It's amazing. But he boxed from a place of fear. He was scared to be embarrassed. He was scared to lose. He was scared to go down.
And fear drove
and that's
him.
why he was such a powerful boxer.
And do you remember?
And a rapist.
But
let's not get into that.
It's actually pronounced therapist, Tom. Well, it's interesting because also in Talladega Nights, do you remember the speech that woman gave to Ricky Bobby when she was trying to get him back into racing?
Yeah.
And she says, you ride that fear like a stallion through the gates of... And it was just this using fear as a tool because it does motivate our elephants. Our elephants are unconscious.
There's a great quote by Customato, which is Tyson's boxing trainer, who says, the coward and the hero feel the same fear. The only difference is their action.
Ah, that's exactly right. The coward runs away. The hero meets battle with the fear driving them, empowering them, right? And that's where you do the whole, they can take our land and they can take our lives, but they can't take our freedom. I have no idea what that has to do with anything, but it just felt right. Other comments?
Let's see.
I needed to see this today, Melissa Boudreau. I'm glad, Melissa. Actually, so listen, I mean, I'm going to say one thing. I want you to take away from this that I want you to practice love and compassion, and I want you to be mindful of what is, am I being empathic or am I having just a broad love and concern for this person? And that is boundless. It grows with practice. You don't get compassion fatigue, you get empathy fatigue.
Can I tell you a serious story?
Please.
My grandmother was one of the coldest people I ever met in my entire life. And she had been raised by, hired girls and things like that. That's what they used to call it back in the 20s.
Wow.
And when she
Get me a hired girl, see?
When she got into end-of-life care, into hospice care, she was able to be empathetic with the nurses for the first time in her entire life because the nurses were empathetic with her. They literally taught her empathy at the end of her life. She wasn't even empathetic to my aunts and uncles while they were growing up.
Now, are you defining empathy the way we're defining it? Was she feeling their pain, or did she just love them?
She was loving them because of the empathy that they had shown her.
So do you think they were showing her empathy? In other words, they were feeling her pain and reflecting it back to her, or were they showing her love?
Good question, because I wasn't there, but she definitely described it as empathy.
As she described it as empathy.
She described
it. Yeah,
it.
so the question is, again, when we misdefine our terms, we get the conclusions wrong. So it could be that it was empathy, but I would even say that how many of us have experienced unconditional love? And when that happens, you feel a liberation to be yourself. You can make yourself vulnerable. You can do things you would never do.
This is why people love dogs. And this is why when that stupid Sarah McLachlan commercial comes on, it's like, in the arms of an angel. Logan just cries, and he can't stop crying.
He can't stop crying. You know, I'm going to tell you guys a secret, Z-Pack. So when we were planning the show, because we don't really plan the show, minutes before, Tom pulled up that clip, And of course, Logan's like ready to cry. And I'm watching these dogs like, making these sad faces, and they're getting ready to be put to sleep. And Sarah McLachlan, in the arms of the angels. And I'm, tears are welling up in Logan's eyes. And I'm like, I feel nothing, Tom Heineber. I feel nothing.
Pam says, and cats. No, Pam.
No.
Nobody likes cats.
Cats are terrible.
I like Cats. The musical, too. But the thing is, we were going to use that clip to open the show to get people feeling something, feeling empathy for these animals, and then cut them down and say, what you just felt is BS. But then it turns out YouTube or Facebook killed it because of copyright. So that all being said, though, Tom Heineber, I think once we define our terms correctly, I want you guys to go out and think about this. Try it in your daily practice, right? What do we got here? Thank you for having this conversation. You're welcome, Angela White. Beth Tunstall, I always say I used up all my nice at work. Compassion fatigue and burnout is no joke, Beth Tunstall. So, Beth, I think, again, I would argue you have empathy fatigue. You're feeling everybody's pain all day and you're dealing with all this crap. And not only that, but there's other types of fatigue, right? It's click fatigue, EHR fatigue. There's administrator fatigue, where you're tired of being told how to practice by someone who's not. But here's the best thing. The administrators love to have, and I'm not saying all of them, I'm saying the ones that think they're just going through the motions of like, oh, well, this is how we get our doctors and nurses to be more empathic. Well, this is how they will have in-services on empathy. Okay, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, okay? How about this? Have everybody come together and learn the definition of empathy and compassion and practice compassion together, because I can teach you the Buddhist meditation on compassion in like 5 minutes, and we'll do it in a future episode. By the way, Tom Heineber, have you ever done ecstasy?
Hell yeah.
Okay. Do you know that feeling on ecstasy?
Actually, I did MDMA, Z, because I'm classy.
Well, nowadays the kids call it Molly because they're dumb. We used to call it ecstasy. The feeling on ecstasy, and I don't advocate doing drugs, people. I'm just saying the feeling on ecstasy is an unbounded love. I don't think it's empathy. I think it's compassion.
You think so?
Because I don't feel, I'll tell you, I'm not going to tell you an example.
But you're both on ecstasy, so you're both like, dude, we feel the same, dude.
It's a resonance, if you will. But
dude, on ecstasy, I will hold my male friend's hand,
No.
and I will be like, bro, I always thought you were special.
Look how uncomfortable he is. Look how he's just squirming. But you know what? You give him a tab of MDMA, and Logan will be like, this is why I'm so conservative. Because when I was a kid, this happened to me. It's amazing. No, but it is. It's unboundless concern for everybody. For many people experience this. You can get the same experience. Empirically, I have confirmed this. The same experience by the Buddhist meditation when you do it right. It's a boundless love, and it's a joy. And it sounds fruity and weird, and Tom is already judging me, I know, but I'm telling you, this is a fact, ZPAC. I have experienced it empirically.
No, I'm looking at you confused, because I don't even have that good of a mastery over my basic emotions. So I'm not sure how I'm going to get to loving the whole world.
Tom Heineber,
when I just yelled at a guy in traffic on my way to Subway the other day. You know?
I'm not saying I can do it every day. I can say in the height of a meditative state, I can have that experience, which means it's practice. Also, Tom, here's an interesting point. I am 43 years old, about to turn 44 next year. Right. You're 27. Mm-hmm. When I was your age, I was probably less emotionally developed. I had a lot more discipline than you do. I had a lot more I could study, I could focus, and actually that's fallen away. My discipline's fallen away, but what has grown is something I like to call wisdom, which is I see things a little differently, so I can control impulses, I can see things as they arise, but it took practice and age. So I'm actually encouraged that by the time Tom's my age, he's going to be dead and in jail, but also enlightened.
That's true.
Yeah.
Well, there was an interesting story about the Buddhist monk who attained enlightenment or nirvana. Because in Buddhism, if you don't know, when you attain nirvana, you just kind of become one with the all. You die and you become one with the all. You meet God and you realize you are God and you're one with everything, and everything is all one just blanket, right? He eschewed going into that warm, gooey allness to go back and practice compassion on the whole world.
Right.
And he's seen as sort of a saint in Buddhism.
That's the Bodhisattva, the Buddha that gives up nirvana to come back. And actually, what the Buddhists will teach in that teaching, and this will tie this up nicely, is that when you come back, do not focus on what they call sentimental compassion, which is, translation, empathy. and they go through this, feeling other people's pain, because you will get exhausted. Focus on detached love and concern for all entities in the face of suffering, and inspiring them and teaching them to relieve suffering. That is what a bodhisattva or a Buddha on earth does. And I think, again, I see Buddhism not as a belief structure or as a religion, but rather as a theory and practice and empirical science of the mind. It's really interesting.
I'm sorry, but I'll deal with your Foley bag after I meditate on it so I can do it compassionately. Elizabeth says.
That's amazing. I don't know why, but my feed is frozen. I want to make sure that their feed isn't frozen too.
Well, we've gone about 50 minutes.
Yeah, I think we're
My
ready
feed
then.
is fine. You
Call the
want to
code.
wrap it up? Call to action, final thoughts?
Okay, so the call to action, let's define our terms correctly in healthcare. Empathy is feeling other people's pain and acting on that feeling. It's a narrow spotlight. It causes us to make mistakes in moral judgments, mistakes in medical judgments, and it burns us out. Compassion is love in the face of suffering and concern for others, mixed with kindness, which is behaving in a way that reduces suffering, including towards ourselves, and mixed with intelligence, which is using actual Logan? Science! To improve your decision making and the suffering of human beings. We should be cultivating compassion. There is no such thing as compassion fatigue. It is empathy fatigue. And we should be checking our empathy and saying, okay, I get it. I'm going to detach a bit and feel love, and I'm going to practice that. And it can be practiced, it can be cultivated, and it can help us to prevent burnout, to take care of our patients better, and to build Health 3.0, which is a system in which empathy in small amounts is fine, but compassion is absolutely a must. What do you think, Tom Heineber?
I agree with Z. And y'all need to go like and share and rate us on iTunes. What's up, what's up, what's up, what's up?
We out.
1, 2, 3.
Just give me patience, yeah.